Today we're going to be looking at research summaries and synthesis on flipped classrooms, an emphasis on middle childhood math classrooms by Nicole Lang. The reason that I chose to research this topic was because myself, as a fifth grade math teacher, and the sixth grade math teacher that I work with are looking at implementing flipped learning environments into our classrooms. So we started a little bit last year, but we are progressing more this year. So I wanted to look at the impact that a flipped math classroom would have on my students, particularly in those middle grades of fifth and sixth grade. There was not a lot of availability on information on those particular grades, so I did have to kind of open it a little bit to flipped classrooms in general across grade levels K through 12, and then the subject matter as well, although the majority of them still fell in my specific categories. The majority of the articles that I found were primary sources that discussed different case studies that have been done in the flipped classroom. So again, there was little research about the younger classes, the younger grades, which is why I looked into a more general scope of the flipped classrooms. So to begin with, we need to look at what most flipped classrooms may look like. One of the studies done by Lowe was in 8th grade math classes, or a group of them. And in those classes, before they went to class, they were instructed to watch 2 to 3 minute videos, or 2 to 3 6-minute videos. They chose to make sure the videos weren't longer than 6 minutes because of the research that had been done previously that said if it was longer than 6 minutes, it was too long to keep their attention. And then they had a quiz to take that did count for points to give them a little incentive to check what they had learned. And then in class, they had a collaborative problem solving activity or a group discussion, something to get them involved with each others. As the students worked, teachers circulated and provided assistance to individuals and groups. Another study done by D'Anto and Miller was in a 4th grade math class, and the way that this worked is that they would front load curriculum online, so this could be through a video. And then in class, the students would turn in the recording sheet, they would have a short review time, and then take a quiz over what they had learned, and then they would have interactive application tasks, which would include discussions or collaborative work. A study by Lowe and Hugh looked at 15 different research articles on flipped classrooms, and they kind of summarized what happened before class, during class, and after class. So before class, students were expected to watch instructional videos, read any text materials, take notes, and complete online exercises such as quizzes. And then during the class, often they would review, there'd be individual practice, small group activities, and a student presentation or some sort of project. In one of the studies, after class, students were supposed to have a self-evaluation. We'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But most of the classes didn't have anything that they were supposed to do afterwards. One of the main focuses of the studies that I found was academic success, because this is the biggest impact that we're looking at. Overall, students who participated in a flipped classroom environment tended to do better than their peers in a traditional classroom. Their scores were either better, sometimes very significantly, or about the same. There didn't seem to be a negative impact on academic success. One of the studies that showed this was a study that took place in Greece with 2 fifth grade classes. One of them was a traditional classroom, one of them a flipped classroom, but both of them were looking at history. They looked at the pre and post data for their summative assessment, and they had 4 different categories for these assessments. Historical content memorization, understanding the concept of time, understanding historical sources, and historical analysis and interpretation. And as you can see, in all areas except for the memorization, the flipped classroom did better. The researchers thought this was because more time was spent on higher order thinking activities in class, and these three categories were higher order thinking, where the memorization didn't seem to have an impact either way. One of the other things that was looked at in a lot of these studies was homework completion. There were still problems with students completing assignments, but most of the teachers saw an increase in the homework completion. There was an article by Gillette, Moore, and Steele where two different studies were done, as two of the teachers were in their own classrooms and set things up slightly different. In Gillette's 8th grade math class, the homework completion rate raised by 5.4% from when they were doing a traditional classroom, a non-flipped classroom, to when they were doing a flipped classroom. Moore's experiment looked at her 7th grade math classes, and the homework completion rate raised by an average of 13%. One class raised by 19%. Then there was also a study on some 4th grade classes that found that their missing assignments also reduced. In the first quarter, when they weren't flipping, they had 2 and 35% missing assignments, and then in the third quarter, when they were flipping, 1 and 35%. I talked a little bit before about the self-evaluation, and this goes with self-regulation. Lay and Hoang looked at self-regulation, adding that to a flipped classroom. So they compared a flipped classroom to a flipped classroom that added self-regulation, which meant that students were setting goals for themselves and assessing whether they met those goals or not. And then they compared those two classes, which were 4th grade classes, to see if adding self-regulation had any impact. They found that it did. Before they started, they looked at where students fell in self-regulation prior to this experiment, and those that had higher self-regulation, if they're in the self-regulation flipped classroom, did extremely better academically. Those that had lower self-regulation didn't do as well in the self-regulated class. The level of self-regulation didn't seem to have any impact on the traditional flipped classroom. So the biggest difference was between those higher self-regulated students. The self-efficacy of the students in the self-regulated flipped classroom was higher than that in the traditional flipped classroom. And then by the end of the experiment, self-regulation was also higher in the self-regulated flipped classroom than the traditional flipped classroom. So there were positive effects of having students evaluate their learning after each and every class. One of the other big parts of a flipped classroom is the peer interaction. In the study where they looked at 15 different research papers, they all talked about the fact that they need to encourage more interaction in a flipped classroom than in a typical classroom. In Lowe's individual study, her and the other teachers that were involved didn't feel that their students were participating in the amount of peer interaction that they wanted, so they added so many competitions between groups in order to hopefully higher the level of interaction between students, and this did work. They also surveyed the students before and after the competition was added, and in all categories, the students seemed to have higher appreciation for what was happening after the competition was added and after more interaction was taking place. There are some challenges, though, when it comes to students. There are students that aren't used to the idea of a flipped classroom and struggle with it. Sometimes the videos were too long, so the students weren't able to focus, which is why in the one study they made sure they weren't longer than 6 minutes. The videos were boring and weren't interactive, and this caused some of the students not to be able to engage with the information. Some students found that they didn't understand what they were supposed to be doing during their group work time. And sometimes the homework that the students were now doing took more time than the traditional homework, which was frustrating for both students and parents. And also, depending on the setup, if students had a question while watching the video, they couldn't ask it immediately, and this caused them to become frustrated as well. In many of the cases, students enjoyed what they were doing. They liked watching the videos because they felt that they were prepared for class because they could watch it and rewatch it as many times as they need it. They also liked the fact that teachers could give them immediate feedback or assistance when needed because they were just wandering around the classroom helping students. Again, some of the students didn't like it initially because of the change in instructional approach, but this seemed to be the case more in higher level classes. One of the studies that looked at fourth graders also looked at the idea or how parents felt about. And as you can see, most of the opinions were positive. They saw that their students were improving more than on average, or on average overall, their academic improvements. There's less stress at home because students weren't actually trying to figure out the problems. Parents did have some concerns because they didn't think they could learn that way, and some parents felt disconnected from their learning because they weren't seeing the homework. Teachers overall really enjoyed this. They thought better use of time was occurring. They thought that students had more enthusiasm, confidence, and motivation. Students were showing greater responsibility. Test scores seemed to be better. Overall, it was a worthwhile method of teaching, although it did take a lot of time for teachers to create. They needed some technology support as well, and they needed parents and students to have more information. Overall, studies show that students participating in flipped classroom instruction either did the same or better academically than those in a traditional classroom. Teachers are able to work with students in small groups and individually to help keep all students on track. Homework completion seemed to improve because students wanted to be prepared for class discussions. And many articles mention the time it takes for teachers to prepare, but agree that flipped classroom has positive effects on students, so it is worth it. Some of the things that I'm taking away is that I wish there was more information, but I did find things to apply to my classroom this year. And I need to make sure that I'm going over expectations very carefully with my students and model the routine so there isn't any confusion. I also need to make sure that I explain to my parents what is happening. With the videos that I create or use, I need to make sure that they're interactive and that they're shorter so that my students are engaged in learning, actively learning while they're watching them. I also want to add an element of self-regulation for my students because that seemed to have positive impacts as well, so that they can see what they're learning and what they need to learn. So overall, my experience of looking at research for flipped classrooms was very informative, and I'm taking away a lot of information on what to do in my classroom and have some ideas of what some problems may be when I first start out with my students. Thank you.